Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Wimmer, author of The Summer of 1876. Thank you all for tuning in, whoever is tuning in and wherever you are, live on YouTube, or if you happen to watch this video down the road on the National Archives YouTube channel. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And of course, a huge thank you to everyone at the National Archives for the invitation to do this presentation. This certainly was not something I ever dreamed of being able to do when I wrote the book. It's a huge honor to be able to do this. So thank you to everyone behind the scenes. A huge thank you to the tech folks, the technology folks at National Archives who has helped me get this thing all set up. I'm not the world's greatest technology person, so thank you everyone for helping me get this set up. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this will be a decent and fun presentation. So the basics of what I want to try to do here today are to do, I guess, what I've been thinking of as the Sports Center highlight version of the book. I'm going to cherry pick some of the interesting highlights from the book, which are also, of course, in that critical summer of 1876. And then we're going to walk through the timeline of those to show you how close they happened to each other and sometimes happened on top of each other or overlapped in long periods of time. That's going to be the basic context here, the basic point of the presentation. But before we get started with any of that, I want to give you a little bit of information about myself, explain to you who I am and where I came from. I promise I will go through that stuff quickly, so I'm not boring anyone to death. That is certainly the worst possible outcome of this presentation. So we're going to start with that. I want to give you a little bit of the genesis of the book too. I'm the type of person who always really likes that stuff. I'm the guy who bought the DVDs of the movies and watched all the behind the scenes special features so I could see how the movie was made and how it got written. I always like that stuff. I hope you do too. So I'm going to share a little bit of that. So let's start with basically myself. I am Chris Wimmer, as I just said. I was born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa. I went to the University of Iowa for college. So yes, I am a long-suffering Iowa Hawkeye fan. If anyone's in the comments right now and they want to insert their jokes about how boring Iowa football is, I completely understand and I agree with all of them. Don't worry. That's what I grew up with. I was there during some really tough years at Iowa football. But after that, I went out to Hollywood and worked in the film industry for 14 years. It was always my dream to be a movie director. I was that kid with the big dream who thought he could be a movie director from Des Moines, Iowa. And I went out to Hollywood and I was fortunate enough to be able to work out there for 14 years, which was an incredible experience. And I had a lot of those dream come true moments of standing in Hollywood and going through some of these experiences thinking, I can't believe I'm here. This is incredible. But ultimately, I was never able to get to that director's chair and do what I wanted to do. But over the course of those 14 years, I spent the last 6 focusing exclusively on writing screenplays. I worked with a screenplay partner, and he and I wrote lots of different screenplays, and we came very close to selling several of them. And then we had that story that ends in the way so many do, where we just couldn't get over the hump. We couldn't sell any of the screenplays, and eventually I just got burned out with the whole process and decided if I'm going to do anything else with my life, it would be to write about college football. I decided I'm going to go into a career of sports journalism. So I came here to Phoenix, Arizona, where I am now, and went to Arizona State University to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and got a master's degree from journalism and embarked on a career to become a college football writer. That was the next career path. And during that whole transitional period, I was becoming addicted to podcasts. And I think like many people, I think it's probably the obvious first step when you decide you want to test out this thing called a podcast and figure out what they are and how many are out there and what you're going to like. You open up a podcast app and you type in whatever subject you're interested in listening to. And so, of course, I did that. I listened to all kinds of college football podcasts. And naturally, one of the things that I tried to find was a podcast dedicated to true stories of the Old West. And at the time, this is back in 2016, 2017, there were 4, 5, 6 podcasts that told stories about the Old West, but none of them produced episodes regularly. And none of them produced episodes the way I really wanted to hear them. I had heard podcasts that were really creative, where they would tell long form stories over multiple episodes with music and sound effects, just like a TV show, like an audio TV show, or like the old time radio plays or radio dramas from the 30s and 40s. And so that's the style that I wanted to hear. And so I thought, man, I think I can actually do this. This is a really interesting creative medium here. I could take some of the stuff I was doing in Hollywood and transfer it to the podcast world. So I started a podcast called Legends of the Old West, which I apologize. There we go. For my screen sharing is technology glitch number 1. So I started a podcast called Legends of the Old West, which is exactly that. It tells the true stories of some of the biggest and some of the most underrated or undertold stories of the Old West era. And I would try to do it in a long form series. So you get enough detail, you get a lot of detail, but also hopefully a very entertaining, fun, fast package. And it was through this podcast, the creation of this podcast, while I was still working at a small newspaper in Brenham, Texas. So shout out to Brenham, Texas. If anyone's ever heard of Brenham, Texas, it's about an hour outside Houston, and that is where Bluebell ice cream is from. So if you've ever eaten Bluebell ice cream, you know what Bluebell ice cream is. That's how you probably know of the town of Brenham, Texas. I was working there as a small town newspaper reporter, and I was becoming addicted to podcasts, and I decided I wanted to start my own podcast. And this was the result, Legends of the Old West. And it was through this podcast that the book happened. It was a direct result of this podcast. So I knew in the very beginning when I was starting a podcast that I'd never done one of these things before. I had to teach myself how you made one of these things. And then, of course, how you get it out into the world and how you tell the world that it's there and it exists. So one of the early marketing efforts I did was like an indirect marketing effort, which was basically, I knew I had to start with the biggest, most prominent stories of the Old West era. Name recognition was probably what was going to interest most people who just found the podcast randomly on their own. So I started with the story of Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral, and I quickly did stories of Wyatt Earp and Tombstone and the gunfight at the OK Corral, and Jesse James and Deadwood and Wild Bill Hickok and Red Cloud's War, the first major Native American campaign versus the U.S. Army on the Northern Plains in the late 1860s. And I was doing all these stories and doing all this individual research on these ideas because they were really prominent and really popular, and I really wanted to tell those stories first. So that was what ended up leading me to have the epiphany that I had in 2019, and I'll get to that in just a second. But the next step on top of that was that at the same time, I started another podcast called Infamous America. And season 2 of that podcast was the amazing story of the 1919 World Series baseball scandal, the Black Sox scandal. And as a part of that really heavy research process for the Black Sox scandal, I went way down a rabbit hole of reading the entire history of early baseball. I went all the way back to the beginning and traced its roots. And as a part of that process, I learned that the National League started in 1876. So along came the summer of 2019, and I had done all this research for Legends of the Old West, of all these stories individually that all had some component that happened in 1876. I had also done the baseball story, the Black Sox scandal, which had a component for 1876. And it was in the summer of 2019 that it hit me. So many of these stories have so much overlap, and there is about a 90-day period of time when all of these huge events happen. And that's a really interesting story that I had never seen in any of the other books I had read. Of course, each book individually focuses on the career of Jesse James, as it's supposed to, but it doesn't tell you that just a couple hundred miles away, Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson are working in Dodge City at the same time that Jesse James is doing a lot of the things he's doing in that specific year of 1876. And so the context and the overlap of all these major storylines really intrigued me. And so a year later, I decided I was on a phone call with a guy at Apple Podcasts who ended up becoming a really good friend and really critical to our launch of our small podcast business. And I just randomly mentioned to him, hey, I've got this book idea and here's what it is. And I told him about the book idea really quickly. And he said, oh, you know who you should talk to is the woman who runs the Macmillan Publishers podcast division. She might be really interested in this story. So he connected me to her. I did a quick pitch for her about the book. She liked the idea. She connected me to a vice president at St. Martin's Press. I did a quick pitch for her. The two of them did a quick pitch for an executive editor at St. Martin's Press. He liked the quick pitch idea. He asked for a proposal. I wrote the proposal, and then we were off to the races. March 2021, the book was greenlit, and now here we are 2 years later. It has actually been published, and it's out there in the world. And it's still a little bit hard to believe that this has actually happened. And it, of course, at the time, it sounded like 2 years, May of 2023 was an eon away, and that passed incredibly quickly, of course. So that's a little bit about me, and that's the genesis of the book. That's how this thing actually happened. It came straight out of the podcast, and understanding that I had done all this separate research, but I had never seen a book that put all of these storylines together in one narrative. So that became what I wanted to try to do. I wanted to write a book that focused more on the overlap and the context, and was not necessarily a deep dive into any one subject, because of course, you can go buy incredible books about each of those subjects individually. So I wanted to do one that was about the context. So here was here are the 5 basic storylines that I put into the book. So obviously the biggest one is the U.S. Army campaign on the Northern Plains. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, all of that culminates in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Next is the Deadwood storyline, the rise of this raucous boom town in Dakota Territory. There was an illegal mining camp that grew into the richest boom town in American history, and of course was the setting for the end of Wild Bill Hickok's life. Then there was Dodge City down on the Kansas Plains, where Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson teamed up as lawmen for the first time. And then there was the Jesse James storyline. He robs a train in July of 1876, which then helps lead him a little bit to this big disaster that happens in September 1876. And as I just mentioned, National League Baseball started, and the first season of National League Baseball is playing its games on the East Coast and what we would now call the Midwest, all during that whole time frame of the summer of 1876, and then of course the spring and into the fall. And in the background, while all of that is happening, there is also the first World's Fair in American history happening in Philadelphia for 6 months. So that's also operating in the background, as well as what ended up being, at least at the time, the most chaotic presidential campaign in American history. The summer of 76 was the campaign, or the conventions for the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. It led to the big election in November, which had a totally chaotic outcome that we're not really even going to get into in this time around. But these were the major storylines that all had overlap in that summer of 1876, and specifically in the 90-day period of time that I referenced earlier. So what we're going to do is walk through some of the highlights of those. So I'm going to show you an amazing timeline. This is the peak of PowerPoint skills that you're about to see right now. So we're going to get into the timeline, and I'm going to show you some of the events. So first up on the list is a slide that apparently I missed. I apologize. First up on the list is the Battle of the Rosebud that happened in June 17th, 1876. That was the first major engagement of this campaign, of a whole long campaign. So what happened was, this is again something I really enjoy looking at. So that I put a lot of this in the book, but I'm not going to go through all of it right now. But I always like to know how things happened. Nothing happens in a vacuum, of course. Nothing happens in isolation. The Battle of the Rosebud and the Battle of the Little Bighorn didn't just drop out of the sky and suddenly materialize. There was a long buildup to them. And the buildup really starts, for our purposes here today, in about February of 1876. This gentleman on the right side of your screen is General Phil Sheridan. He was the commander of the military division of the Missouri, this area in red that you can see on your screen. Everything from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, that's his domain, and everything from the Canadian border to the Mexican border down south. That's his domain. He supervises everything there. Now, of course, in that domain, up in that Montana, Wyoming area, and what was then called Dakota Territory, North and South Dakota, that was the domain of the Northern Cheyenne and the Lakota. At the time, they were supposed to have had all that land up there in perpetuity. But at the end of 1875 and leading into 1876, President Ulysses S. Grant greenlit a plan to allow General Phil Sheridan to send the U.S. Army onto the Northern Plains and round up all the last free roaming Native Americans who were there and force them onto reservations. So what Sheridan wanted to do was to send 3 Army columns out onto the Northern Plains in February of 1876, which made a lot of sense militarily, because that's when the Native American tribes would be scattered in their camps, their winter camps, small camps spread out around the landscape. It'd be deep in the winter, so they're probably starting to run out of food a little bit. The horses are at the weakest. Generally, the camps, the villages are at their most vulnerable. But of course, it's a very obvious problem with starting a military campaign on the high plains in February 1876. There's a very obvious reason why nobody ever did that. The weather was brutal. It was bitterly cold. There were feet of snow on the ground. A blizzard can come around at any time. The wind is always whipping. It's a terrible time of year to attempt a major army campaign with 3 different army columns in the field at the same time, all somewhat trying to work together toward a common goal. But Sheridan wanted to do it anyway. And the only thing that was able to happen in that spring was one strike by General George Crook's column, the Wyoming column. And I think if I advance further, I can give you a little bit of a viewpoint of this. So here are the three columns that Sheridan wanted to go out into the field. The Montana column from Fort Ellis near Bozeman, Montana, the Dakota column from Fort Lincoln near Bismarck in today's North Dakota, and then General George Crook's Wyoming column coming up from Fort Fetterman. So the only thing that was able to happen was Crook was able to get into southern Wyoming and make a strike against one village in March of 1876. The other two columns were hopelessly delayed, and they were not able to get out into the field. Crook went up and made his one strike, then came back down, and then there was just delay after delay after delay until the main campaign really got started in May of 1876. And that's where we really start running into problems, that by then, that's exactly what General Phil Sheridan wanted to avoid. As the weather warmed and the grass started growing, the scattered winter camps on the high plains of the Native American tribes started merging and combining and growing, and eventually grew into one huge village that was probably the largest village in recorded history on the northern plains. So what ended up happening was exactly what Sheridan wanted to avoid, though there was probably very little hope that it was actually going to work out in the first place the way he had planned. So what ends up happening is, there we go. The Battle of the Rosebud happens on June 17th. That is, once again, General George Crook riding up into, I'll go back one slide, riding up into southern Montana with his column, and then engaging with about 700 warriors from the Lakota and Cheyenne. So on the morning of June 17th, Crook gets into southern Wyoming. He's got about 1,300 soldiers with him. About 700 warriors have spent all night riding from the village to engage Crook. They know where he is. They know he's there. And what ends up happening is what we now call the Battle of the Rosebud. It's about a 6-hour battle in southern Montana. And there were a couple different things that Crook learned from this battle. And this becomes really critical to what happens next. A 6-hour battle between the U.S. Army and Native American forces was virtually unheard of anywhere. The vast majority of Native American action versus the U.S. Army were short lightning strikes. There are certainly some exceptions, but generally the Native American philosophy was to go in quickly, hit hard, do as much damage as you can, as fast as you can, and then get out and live to fight another day. A long, sustained battle that was flowing over the hills in waves and it happening in different places, that was very, very rare, especially on the northern plains. But that's what happened on June 17th at the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook's 1,300 men crashed into 700 warriors, and they battled for about 6 hours until both sides pulled back, and they could essentially each claim victory because neither had crushed the other. So the warriors were able to ride back home, singing songs of victory. Crook's force was able to come back down into Wyoming near the town of present-day Sheridan and say that he repelled this force. He was attacked, his men fought valiantly, and they repelled this force. Now, here's a couple of the issues that happened. Number one, that was exactly what Phil Sheridan wanted to avoid. All of these warriors being able to team up and fight against an army column in one big force. Number two, a sustained battle was something that was brand new. Number three, Crook now knew at least some sense of the size and strength of the Native American army that was supposed to be somewhere out in the hills. Only one of the three columns had even had a glimpse of this, what was assumed to be a huge Native American village. So no one really knew where the village was. It moved all the time, so it was really hard to pin it down. And no one knew how fast it was growing, and therefore how many warriors would be there. But now on June 17th, Crook knows at least some of that. He has a really good idea of where the village is. He's pretty confident that it is somewhere up Rosebud Creek into the hills and canyons in there somewhere. He's pretty sure he knows at least a rough idea of where it is. He knows roughly the size and strength, and he knows that the warriors are willing to engage in a sustained campaign. So when he comes back down to Wyoming, he doesn't say any of that to the other two army columns that are in the field. He doesn't say anything to the Montana column, doesn't say anything to the Dakota column, which by that point have now merged into one giant column, but he doesn't say anything to the two commanders of those columns. On the Montana side, it's Colonel John Gibbon. On the Dakota side, even though I have Custer listed here, he's the most recognizable name. The man who was actually in charge of the Dakota column and then took overall control of those two columns was General Alfred Terry. So Crook didn't say anything to either of those two gentlemen who could really have used that information, but he did communicate it to his superiors, General Phil Sheridan and General William Tecumseh Sherman. Apologies about that. So he says all that to them to make sure that he's on record in stating what happened, but he doesn't communicate to the other two commanders in the field. So lo and behold, 8 days later, June 25th, the Battle of the Little Bighorn happens. By that point, in the 8 days between the Battle of the Rosebud and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Terry and Gibbon and the officers of the now merged Montana and Dakota columns have been doing kind of concentric circles up from the Yellowstone River and trying to find the location of the village. And by that point, they're pretty sure that they have a rough idea of where it is. They're getting closer and closer. And Custer has taken a detachment of about 600 men, between 600 and 700 soldiers, to go out and really figure out where the village is. And maybe he had, these are very classic orders. So he technically has orders to find the village and then communicate with the rest of these soldiers who are in the field so they can organize one big attack on the village, because more than likely it's going to be too much for Custer's detachment of between 600 and 700 guys to handle. But he also has a little bit of freedom to attack if he feels the conditions are right. So it's a very much of a weird kind of plausible deniability situation that happens with Custer. So 8 days after the Battle of the Rosebud, having no idea that the Battle of the Rosebud happened, Custer's detachment finds the village and ends up leading to the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And I'm not going to go into the entire details, all the details of the Little Bighorn, but that's what ends up happening. It's 8 days later. Custer finds out everything that Crook somewhat thought he knew. He discovers just how enormous the village is. He learns about all the different tactics that the Native Americans are using at the time. They are masters of guerrilla warfare, and they really took it to the Army column, and it had a devastating effect. Probably about half of the 600 men ended up dying in the engagement. Everyone who was under direct command of Custer during the engagement ended up dying around the area of what we now call Last Stand Hill in Montana. And so that was what ended up happening. So we had the Rosebud, the Little Bighorn within 8 days of each other. Here, I want to show you a couple of amazing photos. There's a gentleman in Ireland who does wonders with taking old black and white photos and turning them into color. And he created these images. They're fantastic. Here are a couple pictures of my recent trip to the Little Bighorn. So this is Last Stand Hill. For anyone who's never been there, this is part of what is now a kind of cemetery at Last Stand Hill, where Custer and the men who were with him fell. In the background, if you can see a line of trees in about the upper third or the middle of the photograph, that is the Little Bighorn River. Anyone who knows this story, and again, I won't get too deep into it, but you certainly have read about the story of Captain Miles Keogh. He was killed with a small group of his soldiers a little ways away from where Custer died. And this is his small, almost little cluster of gravestones where he fell. And part of the reason I really like this is that you can see a little bit of how the hills looked, how it actually looked there. If you can imagine a small group of soldiers at this position, almost encircled and surrounded by Native American warriors, it must have been one of the most terrifying spectacles you could ever dream of. So this is what happened here. So then 11 days later is when the world finally starts to learn about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. It takes about that long. Excuse me. So what happens after the battle is one of the two steamboats that was supplying the Army columns out in the field, it rushed back to Bismarck in Dakota Territory, to the home of the Dakota column and the 7th Cavalry, Custer's unit. It brings the wounded back to base, and it of course brings all the information of everything that just happened. So the officers, the captain of the boat, and a couple other officers are on the boat. They wake up the newspaper publisher of the Bismarck Tribune, and they dump onto his desk essentially this mountain of information, official dispatches, reports, writings from various soldiers. And the publisher of the Bismarck Tribune, a gentleman named Clement Lounsbury, has the job of writing the first draft of history. We've used that phrase a lot. It's a great phrase. This guy, Clement Lounsbury, is the man who wrote the first draft of history about the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He wrote the first major story that would get out into the world. So he spends all night on July 5th. So on July 5th, he's working all night long, trying to compile all this information and figure out how this battle happened and figure out how to write it into a story. He writes a 10,000 word epic story that he then sends to the New York Herald via telegraph the next day. So on July 6th, when the telegraph line opened in Bismarck, sometime between 6 and 7 a.m., the telegraph operator, a guy named J.M. Carnahan, starts tapping out this 10,000 word article, word by word, phrase by phrase, and sending it to the New York Herald in New York. It takes 22 hours for him to send this story. And this, anyone who's read this story, anyone who's read about this, who's read about the Little Bighorn knows that this is an incredible story. I first found this little nugget about the newspaper dispatches in James Donovan's amazing book, A Terrible Glory. So I would highly recommend anyone who wants to read a book about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, check out Jim Donovan's book, A Terrible Glory. That's where I found this story. And then I started cross-checking it with a bunch of other sources to try to add some more into it. It is phenomenal. So this is what happened. All night on July 5th, Lounsbury writes this article. It gets transmitted to the New York Herald. And then Lounsbury, after he's done writing that story and passing it off to Carnahan, he sits down and writes a 2,000 word special edition for his own newspaper, the Bismarck Tribune. And this is one of the little things that I was able to find during my research process that I had never seen in any other book. So I was really excited to discover this. Here is the actual story that he wrote. This is like the top half of the one sheet, the broad sheet that Lounsbury produced. You can see a little bit of the headlines on the left-hand side. I'll leave this up for a little bit so everybody can try to get a quick look at it. This is the story that's, it details some of the killed and some of the wounded. This was, I thought, a really interesting find, because it's one thing to read a story like this in, for instance, Jim Donovan's book, find this great story, and then to actually see it. This, to me, is what really has the impact. This makes it real. It's something you can almost reach out and touch. I mean, somebody could. This is a digital version of the actual newspaper article. So this is the story in the Bismarck Tribune that really started the dominoes falling. And then from July 6th to July 7th, all the other newspapers in the country started picking up the news and started printing it like crazy. And the story of Custer and the Little Bighorn and what was generally called a massacre at that time, you can see it right here, that was the headline story of the day. But the very next day, or the same day that a lot of people were reading this, down in Missouri, and this is, again, my amazing PowerPoint skills, you're going to see some pretty sweet color coding here, so I hope you all appreciate it. Down in Missouri, the James gang robs a train outside or at a place called what they generally called the Rocky Cut excavation. This kind of isolated area of a railroad line. The James gang robs a train the very next day or the same day that all of this information is, that all this news is breaking. I believe I've got it here. Yes. So here's another newspaper article. So if you were in Missouri this came out in July 9th. So if you're in Missouri on July 9th, the biggest story you're reading about in the newspapers is the story of the Custer Massacre. More details are coming out, more reports are coming out. That's still the big story. But if you're also in Missouri, in the Kansas City Times specifically, you're also reading this story about an organized gang of outlaws. They don't name them here in this article, but everybody knows this is the James Younger gang that has been the premier outlaw gang in the land for 10 years. The James gang probably started its run back in 1866. There was a bank robbery in 1866. That is generally the accepted point at which the gang began its operations. And then here, in the summer of 1876, is when the gang ultimately experiences its downfall. And so we'll get to that in a second, but that's what happens right afterwards. So you had the Battle of the Rosebud, 8 days later, the Battle of Little Bighorn, 11 days later, the news breaks wide. One day after that, Jesse James robs a train. And then 10 days after that, let's work in a little baseball. The first no-hitter in National League history, which is, of course, now the first no-hitter in Major League history. That happened, again, in Missouri. So in St. Louis, Missouri, there was a 3-game series between, I believe, it was the St. Louis Browns and what were called the Hartford Dark Blues from Hartford, Connecticut. They squared off in a 3-game series. The St. Louis Browns crushed the Hartfords, or sometimes the Blues or the Dark Blues, depending on which articles you read. But here's another little nugget I want to show you because I found this particularly interesting. So this is the first no-hitter in Major League history / National League history. So no one has they didn't have the term no-hitter yet. No one had come up with that little 2-word label for what happens when one team doesn't get a base hit during a game. So here's how the newspaper writers had to phrase it to make sure their readers could understand what just happened. So you can see it right here in the middle. For the first time in the annals of the league, 9 innings were played without a single base hit being placed to the credit of one of the teams. That's how they had to describe it. The Hartfords utterly failed to do anything whatever with Bradley's twisters. Bradley was, of course, the pitcher for the St. Louis Browns. Twisters was a common term for, a pitch, basically. So this is how they had to describe the first no-hitter in National League history, also, of course, being the first no-hitter in Major League history. So that happened 10 days after the news of the Little Bighorn breaks and the battle of the Rocky Cut robbery. 2 weeks later, moving up to Deadwood in Dakota Territory. Anyone who knows the story knows how the story of James Butler Hickok, Wild Bill Hickok, ends. Hickok is killed in the number 10 saloon in Deadwood on August 2nd. He spent the entire previous day playing poker. He played all night on August 1st, and August 2nd was the end of the story. His story was in its last throes for that spring and summer as we led into August. He was 39 years old, though he had felt like he had lived the lives of 10 men. If you have never read the story of Wild Bill Hickok, it is really hard to believe that a person crammed so much life into just 39 years. But he did a lot of different things, and by the time he's 39, in the spring and early summer of 1876, he's really feeling weary. His eyesight is failing. He's feeling beaten down, but at the same time, he's just gotten married, and he wants to provide a stake for his wife, who really doesn't need it. She was a very successful circus operator who had her own money and lived very well off, but Hickok had it in his mind that he wanted to go to Deadwood, the site of the newest boom town in America, which at that time, of course, was still an illegal gold mining camp. But he wanted to go to Deadwood and ostensibly make his fortune in the mines or through gold. But of course, he had no intention of ever actually panning for gold or digging for gold. He certainly had no intention of spending his time digging in a mine or standing in a creek for hours on end. What he really wanted to do was gamble. That's how he'd been making a living for the last few months, and you could say the last couple of years of his life. So he went to Deadwood and spent a few weeks gambling, and finally on August 2nd, that was the end of the line. Here's a quick image. So of course, the TV show Deadwood is one of my favorites of all time. This is an image taken from that movie of that fateful moment when Hickok is killed in the TV show Deadwood. And then on the left, the larger image there is a recreation in the location of the number 10 saloon. So anyone who's ever been to Deadwood, and if you haven't, I would highly recommend going. The location of the number 10 saloon is still exactly where it was in 1876. The actual business inside it has slightly changed, but in the basement, they've recreated what they think the saloon probably looked like, at least a decent facsimile of how it probably looked when Hickok was playing poker there on that day on August 2nd. Next, moving back down to Missouri. So after the Rocky Cut robbery in July, in mid to late August, the James gang leaves Missouri for one of the very few times. Most of their work was in Missouri. But there seems to be some evidence to say they were already planning to leave the state to go rob something elsewhere, a bank, a train, more than likely a bank, but they were going to go somewhere else and rob something, basically. But then there was a lot of fallout from the Rocky Cut robbery, which is explained in the book, which I thought was fascinating, that could have helped propel them along on their journey, that they had so much heat on them after the Rocky Cut robbery that they probably felt compelled to leave anyway, even if they hadn't already planned on it. But sometime in mid to late August, they traveled from Missouri up to Minnesota. No one knows exactly when they left, and no one knows exactly how they got to Minnesota, but common logic says they probably took a series of trains. They probably didn't ride their horses all the way there because they got there fairly quickly. What we do know is that by late August, they were checked into hotels in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and they started scouting the area for a bank to rob. The biggest criteria was they wanted a relatively small town that had one bank. They wanted all the money to be in one place so they could hopefully get a big stash. Again, like we talked about with the Native American battles, get in, get out, get as much as you can, as quick as you can, and leave. And so a small town would hopefully have less law enforcement. All the money would be in one place. And so that was the plan. So September 7th. That's the day of the most notorious, most infamous robbery in the James Gang history, and essentially the end of the James Gang. The James Gang picked Northfield, Minnesota, that had one bank, the First National Bank. And it was supposedly, it should have been a pretty easy robbery. The concept was this. This is a view of Northfield taken in 1877, so 1 year after the robbery. So this is exactly how it looked. This is looking into the town. Now, there's a river that runs right through the middle of that photograph, and this is the bridge that leads across the river and into what would have essentially been the town square just beyond the bridge. So the gang rode into town over this bridge. In the background, I want to highlight that large building that looks like it has a balcony. You can't really see the second balcony, but that's a hotel that will become critical to the story. So the plan is this. 3 groups of horsemen, 3 groups of robbers are going to ride across this bridge. And when they hit those buildings in the background, they're going to turn right and ride down Division Street. And here is a look at Division Street. Again, this was taken in 1877. It's a composite photo. So there's a bit of a weird, overlap in the middle there. But this is a great view of actually what Division Street looked like and exactly what the James Gang would have seen when they rode into town. So I've highlighted the First National Bank. It's this tall, 2-story, skinny building on the right. And then on the far right of your frame, you can see the Lee and Hitchcock General Store. And I want to highlight also this. Well, I'll hold on to that for a second. So the Lee and Hitchcock General Store is there on your right. Behind it, butting up against the back of the general store, is the First National Bank. And then over here on the left, on the far left in the upper left-hand corner there, is the hotel. That's a 3-story hotel with 2 balconies there on the 2nd and 3rd floor. So what happened was 3 groups of horsemen, three waves of riders with 3 different responsibilities. The first 3 riders ride into town. They stop their horses in front of the bank. They hitch their horses in front of the bank. And they're the guys who are going to go in and actually conduct the robbery. They go in and they start the robbery. Then group number 2 guys ride in and station themselves outside the bank. They hitch their horses. They hang out outside the bank. They are on crowd control to make sure nothing goes wrong outside while the robbery is happening inside. The 3rd group is supposed to ride in a couple minutes later and essentially cover the escape. They're supposed to ride in, whooping and hollering and firing their guns in the air and just scare everyone away so that the other 5 guys can jump on their horses and everybody can ride out of town at one time. Clean, easy, quick. They've done it a whole bunch of times. They know exactly what they're doing. This should not be a big deal. The problems begin inside the bank. This is a great view, again, from 1877 of the inside of the bank. This is exactly what it looked like. And so this is going to be interesting here. So we've got typically on any given day, there are 4 guys inside the bank. Joseph Haywood there is the senior bookkeeper. And you can see that white, probably looks like a rectangle to anyone watching on the screen. That's a ledger. That's where Joseph Haywood works. That's his workstation. Next to him is Frank Wilcox, assistant bookkeeper. Next to the 2 of them is Alonzo Bunker, the teller who works in that open area. That's where customers would step up and do their business, just like in a bank today. And then over on the right would be George Phillips, the cashier, who's sitting right in front of the vault. That door behind him is the vault that leads into the safe deposit box area. And then there would be a safe at the back of the vault. So there's a vault with a safe inside the vault. The problem was George Phillips was gone on this day. George Phillips had taken his family to Philadelphia to go see the World's Fair. So senior bookkeeper Joseph Haywood had moved from his normal station down to the cashier station, and that's where he's working, covering for Phillips on September 7th. So when the first 3 robbers run into the bank, they jump over the teller's window, they push Bunker and Wilcox to the ground and put their guns on them, and then another robber points his gun at Joseph Haywood and basically asks, who's the cashier? Now, Haywood is in the cashier's position, so there was probably an assumption that Haywood was the cashier. But when Haywood says he's not the cashier isn't there, that's when things start to spiral out of control. The robbers don't understand. They become frustrated as Haywood puts up more and more of a fight and becomes more and more stubborn and refuses to do what they ask and refuses to give them the answers they want. The robbery starts taking longer than it should. And the outlaws are becoming more frustrated and more angry. and they're searching whatever they can find to try to grab money. One of them eventually finds basically a handful of cash in a little box under the teller's window, but they're not able to get any money out of the safe. So as Haywood's putting up a fight and stalling this thing out and being really courageous, far more courageous than most people would be in his place, the downward spiral is happening. So then out on the street, the two guys who are on crowd control are starting to get nervous because townspeople are starting to wonder what's going on. They've seen 5 people ride into town. 3 of them went into the bank. They're all kind of dressed the same in these long linen dusters. They're looking a little bit suspicious. 2 of them are now hovering outside the bank. People start to begin to understand these guys are robbing the bank. So the alarm starts spreading through town. People start yelling it. They start saying it to each other. They start grabbing their guns. And now there's going to be a serious confrontation in the middle of the street. So the townsfolk start firing at the 2 outlaws in the street. So what ends up happening is a gunfight in the middle of the street, a little miniature war between 2 outlaws and various townspeople who have grabbed their guns. Initially, the outlaws are just firing over people's heads and firing at buildings, trying to scare people away, but it's going to quickly escalate into a seriously violent conflict. And at about that time, the last wave of outlaws rides into town. The last 3 guys ride in who think that they are going to be covering the escape, but what they run into is an escalating gun battle. So now they're right in the middle of a gunfight that's raging across the street. It goes even bigger and louder when the next 3 guys get in. And so one of the outlaws who's on the street starts screaming at the 3 guys who are in the bank to get out. We've got to go. This has all gone bad. So eventually the 3 guys who are inside run outside, and now they run into a gunfight. And now it is an all-out battle on the middle of Division Street. And the outlaws are taking fire from every directions. 2 of them end up falling. Almost all of the rest of them are injured in this serious battle. And the part of the reason I wanted to highlight that hotel on the left is that probably the most important person on the citizen side of the action is a 22-year-old, I believe he's 22 years old, student from the University of Michigan who has grabbed a gun out of that hotel lobby, gone up into a 3rd floor window, and is firing down on the outlaws. And he does a lot of damage. And so they're taking fire from elevated positions, from ground level, from this staircase over on the right, this wooden staircase that runs up along the side of the Lee and Hitchcock general store. There's guys leaning around there and firing with shotguns and rifles. It is utter chaos until finally the citizens of Northfield have done so much damage to the outlaw gang that the outlaws are able to get themselves up onto their horses with all their wounded men and ride out of town. And when they rode out of town, they would have ridden away from the perspective of this photo. So deep into the background, down Division Street, and then they escape into southern Minnesota. I almost said Montana there for a second. To me, one of the most interesting things that happens, I think almost the thing that happens next, which I won't get into too terribly much, is the saga. It's kind of an epic journey of survival that happens for the next 2 weeks, where the survivors of the James Younger gang are on the run through southern Minnesota. They have hundreds of people looking for them. There are huge posses coming down from Minneapolis and St. Paul of lawmen versus, and of course, any local sheriffs, any local people are trying to find them. They're on the run in some of the worst conditions you could imagine. This is, almost like a crude version of modern day special warfare training, where these guys have no resources. They're all injured. It's pouring down rain almost every day. They have nothing to eat. They're surviving on whatever they can find on the land. They have to keep moving. They cannot stay still. It is a crazy story of survival of how they get to where they do, and ultimately leads to the breakup of the most famous outlaw gang, probably in American history. If you were going to talk about outlaw gangs, the James Younger gang is probably the most famous in American history. Maybe the most famous individual outlaw you could probably say would be Billy the Kid. You could make a case for Billy versus Jesse versus maybe Butch and or Sundance. But as far as outlaw gangs were concerned, the James gang was the premier gang, and this event essentially ended the gang. And hopefully you've read at least some of this. If you have never read this story before, it is fascinating. And I constantly have people coming up to me and telling me how much they really enjoyed that part of the book, because if you haven't read that specific story, it's one that often gets overlooked when you hear about the story of Jesse James. Somehow, there's never really been a really good movie version of this story, and I have no idea why. If you're going to do something about the James gang, this is the story you would want to do. but it seems to get neglected. So it seems to be a surprise to a lot of people. So I found it fascinating. I really hope everyone else does too. And so what we have next is the last big thing that happens, the Battle of Slim Buttes. So over the course of this summer, after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the Army columns, certainly the Dakota column, which lost Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and hundreds of its soldiers, it retreated back up toward the Yellowstone River. Everybody rested and recuperated. They had to rest, regroup, get reinforcements, resupply. And General Crook's column down in Wyoming was doing basically the same thing. So for weeks, both Army columns were static, just resting and trying to wait for resupply. Later in the summer, they went back out and tried to find the village that they couldn't find previously. So by the time they actually get back out on the trail to try to find the Native American village of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, that huge village has split into two villages. Sitting Bull leads his half of the village up to Canada. Crazy Horse leads his half of the village over toward Dakota Territory. And he basically stays in that same geography the whole time. But the Army soldiers, the two major columns combine, and they still can't find either village. They have a total inability to track down either of the two men they were really trying to find. But finally, by mid-September, General George Crook's column is able to attack one village led by Chief American Horse and essentially exact a measure of revenge for the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He's able to claim that they have retaliated, they have exacted revenge for the loss of Custer. And that basically ends the campaign. That ends the big summer campaign of 1876, though there were other engagements that happened later in the fall, but this marks the bookend. If you want to bookend with the Battle of the Rosebud and the Battle of Slim Buttes, that is essentially your 90-day period where all of these things happened in short order, in close proximity, sometimes almost on top of each other. There's General George Crook, he of the amazing whiskers. And of course, while all this is happening, that entire summer, I didn't even talk about Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. That whole summer, while all those other things are happening, Wyatt and Bat are in Dodge City working as lawmen for the first time together. That tag team partnership will happen for the next 2 to 3 years, but they're setting records for the number of arrests that happened during that first season in Dodge City. Their first season in Dodge City. I want to specify that 1876 was the first major cattle season in Dodge. 1874 and 75 were the earliest inklings that Dodge City would be the next cattle hub. But by 76, the railroad is there. They are the new destination for Texas cattle. And there are hundreds of thousands of cattle making their way up the trail, which of course bring with them thousands of Texas cowboys who want a rowdy good time in Dodge. And even just those first 2 years of 1874 and 1875, the people of Dodge City knew that they needed more lawmen. They had a pretty bad track record of lawmen up to that point. And so they had hired this kind of all-star team to take over, led by Wyatt and Bat. And so Wyatt and Bat went to work and immediately started almost literally cracking heads and throwing people in jail. And they set arrests for that summer. And they really helped clean up the town. They brought a level of law and order that no one had seen before. So they did exactly what they hoped to do. So if we quickly recap here, and see, we maybe even have a little chat coming up, maybe potentially a question coming up. But here are the major storylines again. Just got to Wyatt and Bat at the very end, so they're operating underneath everything. Jesse and the Northfield Raid, National League Baseball. There are lots more baseball highlights in the book. I just cherry picked that one no-hitter. I thought that was really fun. And of course, we didn't even get into something that I wasn't really going to, share a whole lot about, but all the crazy inventions and everything that was being shown off at the World's Fair during that whole 6 months from May 1876 to November 1876. It was incredible. Then, of course, the presidential election. So that wraps up. Man, I feel like I was talking lightning fast there. I can't believe it's already almost been an hour. Hopefully, you were able to digest all that. And I will exit out of my screen share mode so that I can see the chat and see if we have a question. It doesn't look like we have any at the moment, so I guess I could just wrap it up there. So my God, hopefully you could follow it all. Hopefully that worked for everyone. Again, thank you everyone who watches this, everyone who watches it in the future. Thank you to the National Archives. Thanks for being here. Hopefully you enjoy the book if you check it out. I appreciate it.